But right, so the topic of my webinar today is around the challenges and opportunities for collecting and recycling end-of-life fishing gear, which is a topic that's of particular interest to me because I have been working on a campaign at World Animal Protection to do with ghost fishing gear in our oceans for the last 6 years. So to tell you a little bit about myself, let's see. Okay. This is me. I am a campaigner by profession. I've been working in the animal welfare sector for the past 10 years and focusing specifically on fishing gear for the last sort of 5.5, 6 years. I'm the campaign lead for the Sea Change campaign at World Animal Protection. And that campaign is really focused on protecting wildlife from lost and discarded fishing gear around the world. This is a picture of me on the left. That was on a mission that we did in Orkney, recovering ghost fishing gear from Scapa Flow, which is an area in sort of northern Scotland. In the middle, that's a beach in Cornwall in the southwest of the UK, which is a bit of a hotspot for lost and discarded fishing gear, and it might be a familiar sight from an area where you guys are based. And then up top, that's again in Orkney, so you can tell by the colour of the sky that the weather conditions weren't so fantastic. But that is the type of thing that I get up to in my job is often going out on projects, recovering fishing gear with various partners, collecting data, looking at what we're recovering, and then trying to understand what we can do with those materials. So to bring everyone up to the same broad level of understanding, when I talk about ghost fishing gear, what I'm referring to is approximately 640,000 to 800,000 tons of fishing gear, which gets lost or abandoned in our oceans every year globally. That's a best estimate. A lot of people think that could be an underestimate. And not reflective of the true scale of the problem. You can find ghost gear on beaches all around the world, and the type of gear might depend on the fisheries that you have in the region. But the fact is that ghost gear is a transboundary problem. So even if there are efforts underway in one area to address the problem, it doesn't mean that it can't still be experienced in that area as the gear moves around with currents. The reason that World Animal Protection became interested in ghost gear specifically is because research has shown that it's the deadliest and most harmful form of marine debris, and it affects millions of animals around the world. And that's mostly because fishing gear is designed to catch and kill. That's the purpose of fishing gear. And when it's no longer being handled by someone, that doesn't mean that it stops serving its purpose. So we're interested in basically influencing policy and developing solutions to stop the impact of fishing gear once it's lost, or to stop it being lost in the first place. And one of the reasons why ghost gear is a topic that's of interest to a number of different stakeholders is because it also has a huge impact on fish stocks. So ghost fishing gear carries on catching fish that would otherwise be landed. So ultimately, it's affecting the bottom line of fisheries and is impacting on global food security. And so really that's basically ghost gear in a nutshell. And I know that some of you probably are very familiar with this topic, but hopefully that's a kind of broad level of understanding. World Animal Protection are really solutions focused in our approach to dealing with ghost gear. And so one of the things that we did was in 2015, we launched the Global Ghost Gear Initiative, which is now being stewarded by an organization called Ocean Conservancy. And the Global Ghost Gear Initiative is really a multi-stakeholder initiative that is bringing together governments, companies, non-profit organizations, and people operating throughout the fisheries supply chain to tackle the issue of ghost gear, and we're operating all around the world. My role in the Global Ghost Gear Initiative, and the thing that I'm really here to talk to you about today, is co-coordinating the Solutions Working Group. So I won't go into the details on this webinar about how the Global Ghost Skier Initiative operates, but there are sort of 3 work streams which are quite distinct but also interlinked. One is around the collection of data to really understand the scale and nature of ghost gear around the world. Another working group is focused on best practices and policy, and then there's another group that's focused on solutions. And so I work together with Ben Kneppers from Bureo and a lady called Rachel Merritt, who's based in Canada, to coordinate a global network of experts who run solution projects. And the idea of this group is really to share expertise about what is working, and then to create and disseminate guidance about those solution projects to people who are interested in creating their own projects to tackle ghost gear. And we help to catalyze projects and develop new projects. So we'll match people up to share expertise, but also help people with their project proposals and help access funding for projects. And ultimately, we're interested in trying to scale and replicate successful models. So on this webinar, I'll talk to you about a couple of models which I think are really interesting for tackling ghost gear. And in some ways, that work, or the hard work figuring that out, has already been done. So what we want to try and do is replicate those projects in areas where they're needed, so where the impact of ghost gear is most severe. So one of the ways in which the Solutions Working Group has tried to kind of harness all of this information was through basically a short paper, which is called Approaches to Collecting and Recycling End-of-Life Fishing Nets. So I feel like the title is probably quite self-explanatory, but ultimately one of my tasks in the last year with the Solutions Working Group was to speak to everyone, speak to all of the experts, and pool all of their knowledge about what works and what doesn't work, and what some of the common challenges are, into one short paper, which we could share with people who are starting to develop their own concepts for solution projects. So the slides that I'm going to talk you through are really just evolving some of the concepts that are in this short paper that I created, and I'm more than happy to share the link for the paper afterwards for anyone who's interested. So fishing nets. What can you make from them? So I don't know if it's the same all around the world, but certainly in Europe over the last couple of years, there's been a huge surge in interest in circular economy and creation of materials from recycled end-of-life materials. And fishing nets were quite quickly identified as something that you could make new products from. And one of the pioneers in this area was really the Networks project, which is utilizing fishing gear from the Philippines and a number of other locations, but originally in the Philippines, and transforming that into carpet tiles, working in collaboration with the large carpet manufacturer Interface. So this is just an example of what these carpet tiles look like. So the nets are collected in the Philippines by local communities. The nets are then baled, cleaned, and then sent to Slovenia, where they're turned into carpet tiles. And at the Aquafil facility in Slovenia, they're also making a yarn from the fishing gear, which is found in tons of products around the world, from swimwear to leggings to kind of everything in between. And that business seems to have really skyrocketed over the past year. You might also have seen Adidas have been increasing the amount of recycled materials in their products. And most recently, they launched with a lot of PR this trainer, which you can see, and a number of other products have also recently come on the market. On the kind of footwear trend, there's also this company Bureo shoes in Italy, who are making kind of high-end, almost artisanal shoes out of fishing gear. Not totally sure I would wear these ones, but yeah, they're very attractive nonetheless. Also socks, the Healthy Seas project, which is also connected with Aquafil, have been making socks for quite a long time out of fishing gear. Also in Canada, Axiom making sort of hard-wearing bags that you can use for cycling out of fishing gear. Bureo, as well as making skateboards, chairs, Jenga, fins for surfboards, they're also making frisbees. This frisbee was a partnership, I think, with Jack Johnson, and so it was used as a bit of an awareness-raising tool, as well as something that people could use just to kind of when they're down at the beach and connecting them back with the ocean. And there's a lot more stuff happening, and on the kind of smaller scale, so not using a large scale recycling process. We've also seen things like the emergence of local remanufacturing or upcycling initiatives. So there's a company that recently launched in Cornwall in the UK, where they're actually using the nylon nets from fisheries and feeding them back into a 3D printing process and making new products, but essentially keeping that entire process local within the fishing community. And then there's also things like artworks. This turtle was actually, it used to be in our office here at World Animal Protection, and that was made out of nets collected on beaches in Cornwall, and then turned into education and awareness tools by a local artist in the UK. And then the Olive Ridley Project in Pakistan, they've been working to collect fishing gear in Pakistan, and then the local communities, the wives of the fishermen, have been making bracelets to then sell and generate funds to put back into community projects. So, I mean, those are just a few examples of the types of things that we're now seeing being made out of fishing gear. And I think the most interesting thing about this is just how the debate has changed over the last couple of years into thinking about this waste as a resource. So now the dialogue is not so much about how bad this fishing gear is, but how valuable it could be if treated appropriately. But the key part of a lot of these projects is that this waste is much more valuable if captured at the end of life rather than trying to recover it from the sea. And that's really a key kind of point, a takeaway, I suppose, from this webinar that I'd like you all to think about, how we can think about capturing waste before it presents a problem, rather than trying to deal with it kind of after the fact. So I wanted to talk you through a couple of sort of topics that have come up through my conversations with experts who are running projects dealing with fishing gear. And one of the things that's a kind of key takeaway is that logistics are pretty much the key piece of the puzzle for having a successful project for dealing with end-of-life fishing gear. Each project will have unique challenges when it comes to the collection of the fishing gear, the cleaning, the segregation, and the transportation. I think a case in point are these two images, which I've included on this slide. On the right side, you've got fishing gear which has been disposed at the end of its life, so it's no longer being used for fishing, but it's relatively clean because it's not been underwater for a long time. It's been baled and it's been left on the quayside for collection in a pretty easy way, just using these big baling bags, so someone can just pick that up and chuck it into the back of a lorry. On the left-hand side is a net which washed up on a beach in Cornwall. And we were really interested in trying to do something with this net because although you can't really see in the image, it was absolutely huge, and it was a real eyesore on this really beautiful beach. And it was something that people really wanted to have a happy ending to try and recover this net and do something with it. But we couldn't find a recycler that would really work with this material because by the time we'd pulled it out of the sand, it was very contaminated with sand, with dead marine life. And ultimately not really in a suitable condition for recycling. So that's just an example of in the same country, two very different types of fishing net that we'd be dealing with. So the first thing you need to do if you're trying to set up a project dealing with end-of-life fishing gear is to ascertain which material you're working with and what it's made from. So which plastic is the main material, how easily can it be separated? If your fishing gear is predominantly made from nylon, for example, it's going to have a much higher value when recycled, and it's a bit easier to work with. Another key point for setting up a project for dealing with end-of-life fishing gear is the process for segregation and cleaning, which can be incredibly labour intensive, and then how it's going to be transported out of the harbourside area. For the segregation, for example, you're going to want to separate the ropes from the nets, and any different materials which are mixed will need to be separated. And that's something that usually has to happen right there at the harbour, and someone needs to do that, and you're going to probably need to pay that someone to do that, and it's a really important consideration when thinking about the whole process for setting up a project for tackling end-of-life fishing gear. So directly leading on from that is engagement with the fishing community and how that really needs to be considered at the inception of a project. Because if you're going to be asking people to take on these additional tasks of segregation and cleaning, for example, there needs to be some kind of incentive for participation. And, depending on where you are, just sort of cleaning up the area might not be a strong enough incentive to get that engagement. So it needs to be considered really early on. And then I guess also importantly is understanding where you might want to collect your fishing gear. I've been doing quite a lot of work, for example, in Indonesia recently, and at the moment, there isn't really a great system for collecting old fishing gear in the ports in Indonesia. So gear is getting, for example, burned or just dumped on the quayside and then washed out again at high tide. So it's becoming ghost fishing gear in that way. But the installation of places to store the fishing gear where it's not going to be contaminated by wildlife or by the elements, and then it can be easily collected is one of the kind of key steps for addressing that problem. So identifying a suitable location will be really important. So those are all considerations for the early stages of a project. And I think it's also really important to talk about some of the key challenges that project managers working in this area have identified. And there certainly are solutions, but I think it's important to be clear about common challenges which don't seem to be specific to certain regions. They seem to be common kind of internationally. So these are some of the key themes that we saw come out through talking to people. Ultimately, there's just a lack of local recycling facilities where people are able to handle fishing gear, and that could be lack of appropriate equipment. It could be just simply not wanting to handle that material. It could be that they don't have the systems in place to clean and prepare the fishing gear for recycling. So it could be recycled, but there's too much preparation work. But ultimately, when we look at the situation globally, there are actually a really limited number of companies that are willing to recycle fishing gear. And then related to that, you then have the cost benefit discussion of long distance transportation. So given that there are only a number of companies that are willing to accept fishing gear, that often means that it will have to travel a long way in order to be recycled. And essentially each mile or kilometer it needs to travel adds a cost to that process. So at what point does the environmental impact of transporting fishing gear mean that it's no longer really worth doing? The contamination of fishing gear as a waste is just a very, very common problem. If you look at this net in the image, it's similar to the one on the previous slide. It's very contaminated with sand and debris because it's been on the beach for a long time. So in order to be recycled, it will have to go through some intensive cleaning processes, which have environmental impacts, but also are very labor intensive and will cost money. So at what point are you then spending more money than you're going to make on recycling the fishing gear? And then equally, polyethylene and polypropylene are really common materials that fishing gear are made from, and they're a much lower value when being sold as a material compared to nylon. And what's quite interesting is that there are processes for recycling nylon fishing gear, which means that nylon can be regenerated essentially into a virgin material, whereas when polyethylene and polypropylene nets are being recycled, they're kind of losing some of their quality when they're recycled. So that raw material is not as a high quality as the virgin material. So essentially it's lower value when being sold. And then ultimately, portside coordination and logistics increasingly or repeatedly comes up as a problem when I'm talking to people who run these types of projects. And that can be for any number of issues. So contamination in the bins on the port side, having collections that are timely so that there isn't piles and piles of fishing gear accumulating on the quayside and causing problems for all of the boats that are unloading fish. All of these coordination and logistics challenges can be costly and also risk threatening some of the relationships that people have or the positive relationships that they have with the fishing community who are trying to assist in these projects. So I would say that these are didn't mean to do that. These are the key challenges that have come up repeatedly in various geographical locations. And these will be some of the main things that I think, if you're considering this type of project, you need to have a plan in place when you're developing that project. I touched on this a little bit already, but just to kind of expand a little bit on the limited number of players that are dealing with this material for recycling. So I talked about the Networks project and how they were collecting the fishing nets in the Philippines and sending them to Slovenia for recycling. That plant in Slovenia, they're using a chemical recycling process. So basically, they're able to depolymerize these nylon nets after they've been prepared for recycling, and then transform them back into virgin nylon. On the flip side, there's a company in Denmark who are the main operator for everything sort of except nylon, and they use a mechanical process, which is essentially shredding and melting into pellets. And there you have your material, which is at a slightly lower quality at the end of that process, but still it's great because they can handle all the other different plastic materials, including fish boxes as well. And both of those companies are accepting fishing gear and other materials from the fishing industry, essentially from all around the world. There's a really small number of facilities in the world that will handle this material. There's another one in Spain, but really we have projects with plastics where materials are coming from Alaska in the US over to Denmark for recycling, because that's the most suitable route for dealing with that material. So when you're looking at your project, it's also good to consider where you might send these materials and what process your material is going to need to go through. I feel like I've talked about some of the challenges, and I really I don't want the takeaway message of this to be that setting up a project dealing with fishing gear is insurmountably difficult, because although there are some common challenges that I did want to share with you from my experience in this area, I do think it's really important to talk about some of the really great best practice case studies that are out there, which are suitable for replicating in different regions, and certainly projects that we can learn from as we evolve our knowledge in this region. So Bureo are a company that do some really great work in this area, and were one of the early innovators for dealing with end-of-life fishing gear and turning that waste into a resource. On this slide, it's just a couple of the products that they're making out of recycled fishing nets. So you have the Jenga, the skateboard, which was the kind of flagship product, and also fins for surfboards. But they also do a number of collaborations making sunglasses. I've also seen desk chairs, frisbees, all kinds of things. And so they're a company that are based out of California, but also operating mainly in Chile and other parts of Latin America as well. So the thing that's interesting about Bureo is essentially their business model. So they have an inclusive business model. So end of life nets are collected from the coastal communities in Chile, and then essentially the kind of problem that they're solving is job creation and improving the waste management in that area. So the business model from the outset really involves the local communities and engaging them on the topic of sort of economic incentives and turning this waste into a resource that will benefit the local community. Their business model also is looking at the zero waste process. So the process they use results in a 70% reduction in carbon emissions compared to virgin plastics. So that kind of thread of sustainability, it isn't just really about the fishing net recycling itself, it's also about the processes they're using and how that compares to working with virgin plastics. And that's kind of at the core of what they do, from my understanding. They also think about the full circularity of the products that they're making. So because one of the problems that we see is that people are quite quick to have positive publicity about materials or products that they're making out of recycled materials, but those products are then difficult to recycle at the end of their new life. So for example, if you're making clothing which is partly made from recycled fishing nets, but then you're mixing it say with cotton, that's still a problem at the end of the life of the new product, because you'll have to separate the cotton from the nylon, for example. So the products that Bureo are making are designed with the end of life in mind. So designed for easy disassembly. So for example, with the skateboards, all of the components can be separated out and be recycled individually. So you're not then stuck with a kind of just an extension of the original problem that you had. So the full circular economy is considered, and it's a truly closed loop. Then I think the most important thing about this project, from my perspective, is that funds that are generated, they're basically put back into the local community. So there's a real incentive for the communities to participate in these projects, because income that comes from engagement in the project gets put into, for example, like local education projects, and other kind of infrastructural projects which aren't really directly connected to fisheries but benefit the communities living in those fishing areas. So everyone is kind of bought into the model. And ultimately, this means that nets now have a value, because if everyone can see the benefit of engaging in this project, then there's a kind of different approach to how fishing gear is considered. It's seen as something that's a resource, and there is a link then between seeing something as a resource and how it's treated at its end of life. So ultimately, a reduction in discarding. So to summarize the information that was on that previous slide, I think that the learnings that I've certainly taken away from those successful models is that an inclusive business model, it creates incentives and then it reduces barriers to responsible behaviour. And so when we think about how to address ghost gear, we're really thinking about what are the barriers to responsible behaviour. So why aren't people behaving responsibly? Okay, and what can we do to dismantle any barriers that exist? And involving people in an inclusive business model and creating incentives of participation, that kind of goes some way to reducing those barriers, and that's a key takeaway from my understanding. So what's next? For me, and my work in the Triple GI Solutions Working Group, we are wanting to scale and replicate successful models in hotspot areas. So I mentioned very briefly that there's a stream of work within the Global Ghost Gear Initiative for mapping data and understanding where ghost gear is most severely felt, and any kind of trends in abundances of ghost gear. And we'd really like to see more models for on the solution side targeted in the areas where they're most needed. In the Solutions Working Group, we want to continue connecting expertise around innovative approaches. So that could be through webinars like this, presentations, innovation competitions. If any of you are specialists in this area, we would love to have you join our group and connect with the other experts from around the world. We have people from Myanmar, from Australia, from Canada, from Chile, from Europe, all connecting in this group and collaborating on projects. And maybe this is something that you would also like to join us with. We really want to highlight the kind of best practice examples of products and projects that are utilizing fishing gear as a waste resource, and increase the kind of supply chain demand or the market demand for those kind of products, and really highlighting how circular design is critical in addressing some of these challenges in our environment, and thinking about disassembly and end of life at the point of design. And so we have a number of circular economy experts within our group who are kind of championing that message internationally. And if that's you, we'd also love to have you join us. And then in Europe, there's loads of really interesting stuff happening at the moment around the concept of extended producer responsibility and the circular design of fishing gear. And I think that the Europe test case around EPR and circular design, if it's successful, will be replicated in other regions. So I think for anyone who's interested in this topic, to keep an eye on things like the Single-Use Plastics Directive in Europe and the implementation of EPR, which is essentially creating responsibility for the producers of fishing gear for what happens to that product at the end of life, to see how that goes and see what learnings can then be transported to other regions. So these are all kind of areas that I'm really interested in and I'm going to be keeping an eye on over the coming months. And then finally, this is my last slide, I think. I just wanted to promote something that we're working on at Wild Animal Protection and within the Global Ghost Gear Initiative. One of my colleagues, Joanna Toole, she was the co-founder of the Global Ghost Gear Initiative, and very sadly, she died earlier this year in the Ethiopian Airlines crash on her way to the UNEA conference. And we've decided to launch an award to fund projects aimed at tackling ghost gear in her honor, because we were just so inspired by the work that she did and the leadership she showed in this area. So this month we launched the first award in her honor, and I'm really hoping to attract proposals from people around the world, and particularly in Africa, to support projects that meet our criteria. So there's $40,000 available for projects, at least 40,000, I should say. We have received some other donations to increase the value of this. And the applications close on the 10th of July. And you can find out more on our website. And yeah, I would really love to hear from anyone who's interested in applying for this. So you've got just under a month to put in an application, and the focus is on projects aimed at addressing ghost gear. Anything that that chimes with you having listened to this presentation. The types of projects that we would like to support are the kind of projects that I've presented to you, but could also expand on some of those ideas. So if you're interested in that, please do get in touch with us. And yeah, that was it. Thank you very much.
Okay, so we have a question. Tina says, thank you, Christina, very interesting presentation. Any thoughts or comments or examples of government subsidy schemes for recycling? For example, tax breaks, incentives.
With regards to the question about the government subsidy schemes for recycling or tax breaks, I can't think of any example of a government subsidy scheme for recycling, although I think that sounds very logical. It sounds very logical, but I'm struggling to think of an example where that's in place. I know that some projects have used government grants in order to initiate recycling projects in different regions, and I'm curious to see, for example, in Europe, now that there's a big focus on managing fishing gear and other single-use plastics and extended producer responsibility, whether rather than governments creating tax breaks, how the kind of producers will incentivize appropriate behavior with recycling in mind. But I will definitely have an ask around about the government subsidy schemes, and if I come across anything, I can share that information with Steph to disseminate to the group. But I think that tax breaks and for the recycling companies is a really interesting recommendation, which certainly would be quite a useful policy position to come from if trying to encourage like an increasing number of recycling companies coming into operation. So I'm sorry, I didn't really answer your question very well, but that's actually because I can't think of any examples right now.
Okay, thank you so much, Chris. So then Holly Nell, she asks, do we know which polymer is most used in fishing gear? Nylon, polypropylene, or polyethylene?
Okay, yeah, so it depends really in which region and which fishery. So different fisheries use different fishing gear and they're made from different materials. So for example, in Southeast Asia, you have a lot of fisheries using gill nets, which are most commonly made from nylon, so like monofilament nylon or multifilament nylon, and that's very recyclable. In other fisheries where, for example, people are using trawl or purse seine, it's quite often made from polyethylene or polypropylene, sort of like these thicker, bigger nets, but it does vary. One of the challenges that we have actually is that A lot of fishing gear manufacturers are manufacturing fishing gear which is kind of multi-polymer, so it might have, you know, nylon and polyethylene woven into the net, which makes it incredibly difficult for recycling. So one of the kind of policy recommendations we have for net and rope manufacturers is to think about ease of recyclability, and when it comes to the circular design of fishing gear, to think about single polymer manufacturing, so to make nets and ropes just out of one single material, making it much easier to recycle. But I think in terms of what polymer is most common, I think it would really depend on which region and which fisheries you have in operation in your area. Yeah.
Perfect. So Holly, I'll address the second half of your question. But in response, Tina says, 100% no problem, just interesting to reflect that fisheries departments from most governments are probably responsible for setting terms and conditions. Would be lovely to see them also impose some controls, restrictions, and support with regards to subsidizing recycling. So that's just a comment from Tina's.
Yeah,
and then
really
the
interesting,
second,
Sorry.
the second component or part of Holly's question is, do you know if the materials used kind of translates in ghost gear? So is there one polymer that dominates because it breaks, or it is cheap and can be thrown away without, you know, them worrying about the costs linked to that?
Yeah, so that's a really, really interesting point. So anyone who's really interested in this topic, I would suggest that you have a read of a document that was published by the Global Ghost Gear Initiative called the Best Practice Framework for the Management of Fishing Gear. And this is really, it's a guidance document that we created for all the different elements of the supply chain, and it looks at recommendations for all the different actors, from the people running certification schemes, the gear manufacturers, the port operators, the government kind of policy departments and fishery regulators. And within that best practice framework, in the background study that informed those recommendations, we worked with a consultant called Tim Huntington to do a risk assessment of all of the most commonly used fishing gear types in the world. And what he looked at as part of that risk assessment was which types of fishing gear are most commonly lost, and sort of all the different reasons why those fishing gears are most commonly lost, and what is the impact of that fishing gear when lost. And through that assessment, he was able to create a kind of a top list of the most harmful fishing gears when they become ghost gear. So number one of that list, so it is very likely to be lost due to breaking and its low cost, and the different environments in which it's being operated in. And the one that has the greatest impact when lost is gill nets. And so that's very interesting because gill nets are very commonly used around the world. For example, in Southeast Asia, it's a very common fishing gear type used, and it's incredibly cheap to buy, and it's seen as quite disposable, although interestingly it's also very recyclable, but it's considered to have a very short lifespan. So in one of the projects that I was working on in Indonesia, they did a study, and they were estimating the lifespan of those gill nets that they were using to be in weeks, not really in terms of months or years. And so when something is seen as cheap and disposable, the approach to looking after it, I think, becomes less important. And I think part of what the work that we've been trying to do is to emphasize that although it's quite cheap and apparently disposable, it could be recycled and then turned into a resource. But yeah, in that background study, gill nets was considered to be the most problematic, followed by pots and traps used in different fisheries, and fish aggregating devices.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Chris. And thank you, Holly, for your question. Just one last add to the question is, what machine do you use to analyze the chemical structure? Do you know, Chris?
Oh gosh, I don't. No, I don't know. So both plastics and aquafil have different scientific processes for analyzing the structure of the fishing nets. And so for example, plastics, something that they do is they have a kind of fact sheet which tells you, it has images of all the fishing gear that they accept, because there aren't huge numbers of net manufacturers and yarn manufacturers. For example, in Europe, you'll have, a sort of top 10 most commonly used types of fishing gear. And so on their fact sheet, they have images of all the different ones that they've already analysed, and they can say, categorically, we will accept this for recycling. And so that's incredibly helpful because we can share that with people who are interested in contacting plastics to set up a recycling program for their fishing gear. And I'm not quite sure what process Aquafil use to do the same thing, but I would imagine they do something quite similar, especially because their process is a chemical recycling process, and relies on having exactly the right polymer materials to work with.
Okay, perfect. Thanks so much. Then the next question is from Matt Parkinson. He says, how would Chris tackle gear from very poor subsistence community using low value material gears that still have large impacts?
I'm sorry, could you repeat the question? I was trying to find it written down so I could read along, but I can't see it there. So
Oh, okay. So I think Matt's sent it to me in private.
okay.
The question reads, hi Stephanie, my question, how would Chris tackle gear from very poor subsistence community using low value material gears that still have large impact?
So if I understood correctly, so the question was around what would you do for managing the fishing gear in a in a poorer fishing community? Is that correct?
I think so. I'm not quite sure. Maybe Matt, you could clarify in another way. But I guess that's what I take from the question.
Okay, well, yeah. So, I mean, in terms of that, in that question, so there's a really good example of this with, for example, the Olive Ridley Project, who we've worked with a little bit through the Global Ghost Gear Initiative. So, their project is really interesting. They do really amazing work, and so they started their efforts trying to understand the impact of ghost nets on Olive Ridley turtles. So they were finding turtles in large numbers with impacts from ghost gear around the Maldives. And so they did some analysis on the fishing gear that they were finding these turtles entangled in and traced it back to fisheries in places like Pakistan. So it was basically, washing around in the Indian Ocean and entangling these turtles, but they could trace it back to the source fisheries, which were smaller scale fishing communities. And so, for example, in Pakistan, they set up this project to collect and recycle fishing gear, but in that area, there wasn't a recycling solution exactly. So they had, large amounts of net to work with, but couldn't recycle it through, a chemical or a mechanical process. So they dealt with it in a couple of different ways. And I know there are projects where people, for example, send nets to use then in construction or in agriculture. But in their case, they worked with an artist to train local communities in upskilling the women, particularly in crafts that they could make from these, from the nets. And apparently the women are now making more money than the fishermen actually selling these crafts on as a new resource. So I think that model from the Olive Ridley Project is a really interesting one, where it was a solution to not having a larger infrastructure solution available, so not being able to recycle in that region, but working within local communities who were operating more at a kind of subsistence, like smaller scale level, and generate a kind of local small economy there. So I'm not entirely sure that answered your question, because I was a little bit confused, but hopefully that example is helpful.
Okay, Matt just let us know if your question is answered, but he did add another part, which was he was referring specifically to remote areas where transport to recycling, I guess, points is not really viable. So I think you have answered the question.
Oh yeah, yes, I think so. I think that's the best example. The Olive Ridley project example is probably the best one that I can think of. There was also a project with Ghost Nets Australia, quite a similar kind of example with Indigenous communities collecting fishing nets and making art and crafts, which they were then selling as a local opportunity to generate income for those communities. But yeah, I think there are a few out there. Um, to learn from.
Okay, perfect. Then just to correct earlier my mistake in reading out Tinus's question, he wrote there TACs and I said terms and conditions, but he actually meant total allowable catches. Sorry about that, Tinus, but I think you did answer the question anyway. Then Holly says thanks again and really helpful. Then from Willem, he asks, are governments being lobbied by you to introduce legislation to prevent their flag vessels from abandoning fishing gear? And is this type of legislation increasing?
Yes. So, I mean, I think there's probably there's a couple of different answers to that question. So it's quite tricky. But so World Animal Protection, I mean, yes, we have been doing some lobbying and advocacy work, particularly through the Food and Agricultural Organization of the United Nations. So we were quite instrumental in helping to progress some it's voluntary guidelines at this stage for the marking of fishing gear, but within that there's a lot of really helpful policy language which is around the whole issue of why fishing gear gets lost and abandoned, and marking fishing gear is kind of one approach for doing that, but FAO are also working on a global program of work, so doing capacity building workshops in collaboration with the Global Ghost Gear Initiative to talk about best practices beyond just marking fishing gear, but using marking fishing gear as one kind of policy approach that governments could deploy in their fisheries, and looking at things that are included in the best practice framework more generally. I mean, there is legislation, for example, under MARPOL Annex 5, which prohibits the dumping of waste, including fishing gear, at sea. And there are kind of international instruments which capture this topic, but there isn't really a kind of global framework which is as prescriptive, I think, is what you're indicating. However, I think that in terms of whether this type of legislation is increasing, I would say that there's definitely an increasing focus on this topic in the international policy realm. You're increasingly seeing at FAO, but also within, for example, the United Nations Environment Assembly, Sustainable Fisheries Resolution. I think all of these things increasingly are including language which talks more directly about addressing ghost gear, because there's been generally an increase in focus on plastics and other wastes in our oceans over the last couple of years. So whether that translates into direct legislation, I think kind of remains to be seen. We're certainly doing some lobbying and advocacy work on that topic, and are really keen to for others to do the same.
Okay, cool. Thank you. So Tinus, just as a response to your question with regards to the webinar recording, we will provide the webinar recording on our website, the Sustainable Seas Trust website, and I'll send an announcement out. It'll be once the series is finished, so it'll be next week probably. I'll send out an announcement via email chain with the link to the recordings, so you can definitely replay to your staff. Okay. Do you have anything else that you would like to add, Chris? Or
yeah, so I was just reading the comments from Matt, and so I think I kind of understand a bit more what you were getting at, Matt, and I'm sorry for. So you were basically saying that in a situation where recycling or upcycling wasn't really an option for value adding, and the fishery you were talking about was the trap fishery in Angola, and I think that's a really interesting example, and certainly we've had a lot of discussions about whether we want to focus on, you know, the recovery of harmful fishing gear, if then you can't do anything with it when you bring it ashore. And I think that there are some studies that have been done. I think there was one in the Adriatic Sea which looked at the kind of cost benefit of doing that kind of thing, especially thinking about if there's an environmental impact from retrieving gear that might have been there for some time. Sometimes it might be better to leave it in situ. And I think if the gear that is ghost fishing is causing a problem on the sustainability of your fishery, it would still be worth recovering, even if you're not really able to do anything with that material afterwards. And there are sometimes options for example, at the kind of real lower end of your kind of your decision tree, I suppose you could look at turning your waste into, for example, oil. There are some procedures that do that as well. So if you're not able to recycle it, you may be able to still do something with it. But it would still probably be worth recovering if it was causing high impact on that fishery, because the kind of sustainability is really critical, especially for a subsistence fishery. So I would say it would be worth doing. But it's a really interesting topic, and be more than happy to discuss further with you.